Hello, we're live. Welcome to Ignore the Machine. I'm Bradley J. My guest is Rich Rubino. We are going to talk about how this debate, this most recent Republican debate, was different than the previous. But first, I have a couple of questions regarding the front runner in the Republican Party. One, we've seen a lean towards a more pro-choice stance by Trump. He's obviously made the calculation, if he calculates, that the pain that he will suffer at the hands of the pro-life folks is worth it to be seen as reasonable with the pro-choice folks. Is that correct, and is he right?
Yeah, I think he generally is. His general argument is that in the 2022 midterm elections, Republicans did not have this red wave. They only picked up 14 seats. Usually in a midterm election, you pick up about 30 seats. He thinks that was partly due to the fact that this party was seen as too extreme in terms of opposing abortion rights. And if you look at the polling, Americans, when you ask the question, most Americans support abortion rights, but they support them with certain restrictions. Once you get to the 8-9 month, most Americans are opposed to it unless it's for the life of the mother or the grievous health of the mother. But generally speaking, I think he sees the polls and he realizes that, for example, Doug Burgum in North Dakota or Ron DeSantis in Florida signing early abortion bans that could potentially be a hazard for the party in the general election. Now, obviously, those who are opposed to abortion rights, his former Vice President Mike Pence being one of them, are able to make this argument, specifically in Iowa, which has a disproportionate share in the Republican Party of evangelical Christians who are vehemently opposed to abortion rights, that he can take any criticism. Mike Pence will say, well, he's not truly in favor of, he's not truly opposed to abortion rights if he's not making this kind of his flagship issue, if he's saying we should de-emphasize the issue. But you know what? The fact of the matter is, right now, if you take every other Republican candidate together, Donald Trump is still winning by about 16 points. Let's take every candidate in the aggregate. He realizes how big his lead is. He's thinking in the general election, and he does not want in the general election to be kind of pinpointed as a vehement advocate for banning all abortions. So I think that's why he's trying to take this kind of middling stance. And in the end of the day, most of those Republicans who are evangelicals who support somebody potentially like Mike Pence in the primary, most of them are probably going to support, even if reluctantly, are going to support Donald Trump in the general election because of the two major candidates. He's the one who opposes abortion rights, and because he's the candidate who nominated U.S. Supreme Court justices who worked to overturn Roe v. Wade. And that's also, by the way, the Roe v. Wade issue, overturning Roe v. Wade. That's something you can point to Republican voters who say he's not as committed on the issue. He say, look, I'm the one who got Roe v. Wade overturned, so give me credit on that. I think that's generally his argument.
So I misunderstood something there. They're going to still support him even though abortion is their primary issue, and he's against them on that.
It's for most, it's a cost benefit calculation. Okay, in many respects, it's almost like, in a sense, you can say you're holding your nose on that, but
if that's your primary issue, I mean, you're going to hold your nose, and why not vote for somebody that is for your primary issue, which is a real deal breaker for those folks?
Unless you vote for, say, the Constitution Party candidate, whoever that's going to be, who is probably going to take the absolutist stance that all abortion should be banned, potentially, that it's the 14th Amendment, that it's a human rights issue. That position, though, that's going to be well less than 1/4% of the vote. Most of them are going to go. They're going to say essentially, well, Donald Trump is not necessarily in our corner. He's not necessarily our favorite candidate. But you know what? He did nominate Supreme Court justices who got Roe v. Wade overturned. And at the end of the day, if it's between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, Donald Trump is the one that is more committed to our issue. I mean,
but he's not more committed to the issue. He's turned against it.
But he's not saying he's pro-choice. What he's saying is he's saying he needs to de-emphasize some of the early bans. And like, for example, what Ron DeSantis signed in Florida, what Doug Burgum signed in North Dakota, he's saying that they need to de-emphasize that, potentially maybe favor 15-week bans for the states as opposed to 6-week bans. But that's still, from their perspective anyways, that is better than Joe Biden, who Joe Biden is somebody who is in favor of abortion rights. So unless you want to go, if you want to go third party and vote for the Constitution Party candidate, you can do that, but that's generally going to be less than 1% of truly Christian conservatives who are going to do that.
As far as nominating, go ahead.
I was going to say, Ronald Reagan's a perfect example of this. Ronald Reagan, when he was governor of California, signed one of the most all-encompassing abortion rights laws in the history of the republic. He nominated Sandra Day O'Connor for the United States Supreme Court, who had a history of supporting abortion rights in the Arizona state legislature. Okay, 1984, he ran for re-election. Christian conservatives overwhelmingly supported him, and Ronald Reagan de-emphasized the issue in that campaign. It was not a campaign, an issue that he brought up. Later in his presidency, he tended to use the bully pulpit more for it. He actually wrote a book on the subject, but it was the fact of the matter is they're going to vote for the lesser of two evils, or the person that they think will better support their cause, and they're not going to go for Joe Biden. They're probably not going to go for the Constitution Party candidate. So Donald Trump is essentially their best hope from their perspective.
As far as nominating judges, that's any candidate would have done that. There are no candidates that would have said, "Well, I'm gonna appoint or nominate a liberal judge."
Well, yeah, but here's the difference. When George W. Bush in 1999 and 2000 was running for president, they asked him, "Would you have a litmus test? And would whoever you nominate to the Supreme Court be somebody who would be committed to overturning Roe v. Wade?" George W. Bush said there would be no litmus test. Now, the people he did nominate did vote for the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and most people thought that essentially whoever he nominated would do that. But the fact of the matter is, like most Republican candidates, he did not say there would be a litmus test. Donald Trump had a history of saying he's very pro-choice. They asked him about late-term abortions back in 1998, and he said basically that he believes that the right to abortion should be left to the woman, not the government. So he changed his position right before he was running for president, just like Ronald Reagan did, by the way, just like George H.W. Bush did. They were all pro-choice at one point in their lives. And I said Ronald Reagan actually signed an abortion rights law as governor of California in 1967. In Donald Trump's case, when they asked him in 2015 when he was running, and a lot of social conservatives were very skeptical or incredulous of him, they said, "Would you make abortion rights a litmus test?" And you know what he said? He said, "Yes, I would." That endeared them to Donald Trump. Many religious conservatives were for Ted Cruz, Ben Carson, or Rand Paul, respectively, in that primary. Donald Trump basically outrighted all of them and said, "I'm going to make this a litmus test issue." And the people he nominated were Supreme Court justices who voted to overturn Roe v. Wade. Now, you're right. If it was President Mike Pence, if it was President Mike Huckabee, if it was President, if you name it, if it was, if Jesse Helms were president, they probably would have nominated pretty much the same individual, somebody at the Federalist Society, which is a conservative.
Right. These individuals get recommended to them, and they just go, okay. So it's not like you're a genius to nominate judges. I could do that.
You have a point. I mean, it's not that they're not just recommending one. Usually you have a name about 50 potential justices, and then you do a vetting process in your administration. Then you come down to the one that you think is most palatable to your base. That can be confirmed by the United States Senate. And in Donald Trump's case, he had, if you have a majority in the United States Senate, that majority is likely going to confirm a Supreme Court justice nominated by one Donald Trump. But you're right. It's not like he has it's not like the justices he nominated would have been any different.
It's not like he deserves any particular credit for it. There's a committee that chooses them, and he said, or like I would say, okay, you folks decide, and then go, okay, whatever you say.
Well,
which is completely what happened.
I will say this, though. Sometimes justices are not what the president expects them to be.
But that's not germane really here. I mean,
historically, Dwight Eisenhower nominated Earl Warren to the Supreme Court. He later said it was one of the biggest mistakes he made because Earl Warren was seen as a liberal. Gerald Ford nominated John Paul Stevens to the United States Supreme Court. John Paul Stevens was seen as a conservative at the time, but his voting record showed that he was center left. George H.W. Bush, Justice David Souter. At the time, the thought was he was going to be a conservative. Ted Kennedy vociferously opposed him. Later, he said he regretted it. David Souter was later seen as a liberal voice in the courts. There is a possibility that you could nominate somebody that you think is going to be a conservative, but is not. When George W. Bush back in 2006 nominated Harriet Miers as general counsel at the White House, for the seat on the United States Supreme Court. There was opposition from the base of the Republican Party because they did not know her, because she did not have much of a record on issues like abortion or gun control. So eventually she essentially said, I no longer want to be considered, and nominate somebody else. So there is that possibility they're not actually as conservative or restraintist in terms of the United States Constitution as you think they are. But that's why the vetting process, that's why there's a big vetting process on that.
Okay, next. The decision by the judge in New York of some summary judgment decision against Donald Trump's business, finding him liable for fraud like that. And what kind of impact will that have? None?
In the primary, potentially there are some polls specifically in Iowa which shows that there are some conservative voters who potentially might like Donald Trump but would at least consider other Republican candidates. That means that they're not in the camp of there's no God but Donald Trump. They believe that essentially they might be looking at this. They might say, I like Donald Trump. I did very well under his administration, but do I really want this baggage in the general election? Accordingly, I might decide I'm going to go for somebody like Tim Scott or Nikki Haley, Doug Burgum, something to that effect. So certainly it does not bode well for Donald Trump. But that being said, in terms of primary voters, in terms of Iowa caucus voters, he still has an almost immutable lead right now. And it'd be very hard for me to see that there's that many conservative voters who would essentially say, because of this, well, he's not going to look very good in the general election, so I'm going to do strategic voting and I'm going to vote for my second choice instead. And again, last time around, 60% of Republican primary voters voted for somebody other than Donald Trump. He only needed that 40%, and most states are winner take all. So if you're winner take all, that means you only need one more vote than the next person. So if you get 30% of the vote, you win every delegate in that state. And it's very hard for me to envisage a scenario in any state where Donald Trump garners less than 30% of the vote.
So having built his reputation as, we're going to try an outsider, a great businessman as president, does the fact that it was, smoke and mirrors matter? I mean, basically, if he'd put his money that his dad gave him in an S&P fund, he'd have more money now than he does now. He's not that great. Fraud here, fraud there. Has to settle. Trump University.
They have a great football team.
Does that? Right?
They beat Electoral College in the last bowl game.
Does that kind of thing affect anything at all, or is it beyond that?
I think right now it's beyond that. The Vox Populi, the voters' perception is either, and Donald Trump is a very lightning rod. He's very much a polarizing figure. Either you like him or you don't like him. You're not going to I don't think it's going to be one voter in the country, there's going to be the minimus amount. They're going to look at his potential business dealings. This is like going in the past. It'd be like when Bill Clinton was running for re-election in 1996, if people look back at his record as governor of Arkansas. In 1992, that was relevant. In 1996, you can't look back. You have to look at what he did in those 4 years of his presidency. And if you go back to say, well, in 1983, you vetoed this bill, people are going to say that's irrelevant now. In Donald Trump's case, I think if Joe Biden decides in the debates to really go after and excoriate him for a business record, the American people have basically already decided that. There are those who do not going to vote for him because who say, he's a crooked businessman. He gypped his vendors, everything else. Right. And we're going to say, well, no, he was an honest businessman. He created jobs. But the bottom line, that's going to be essentially a secondary or tertiary issue.
So Donald Trump remains the front runner in the Republican primary, yes. Partly because his opponents are afraid. It's one of the rare situations where his opponents are afraid to criticize him. That's a strange situation. That may be one of the reasons. And it may be the case that when after it appears that he will not be struck by lightning, they'll think, well, we have nothing to lose, but at some point we are going to turn on him. Which brings us to the debate. The first one was sad. It seemed like they're a stage filled with cowards that were afraid to do what the normal thing that candidates do is highlight failings of any opponent. They were afraid to do that. That's weird. Why even have a debate? It was so disgusting, I didn't even watch this one. So you're going to have to tell me if this one was any different.
This was a little different, actually. Just like the first one, Donald Trump was not there. But unlike the first one, Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson. Asa Hutchinson didn't even make this debate. Were not the only ones criticizing Donald Trump. Ron DeSantis, by the way, Ron DeSantis, who was once a protege of Donald Trump, who Donald Trump endorsed when he ran for governor over the establishment candidate Adam Putnam, he went after Donald Trump and said Donald Trump needs to be here. He needs essentially we need to debate Donald Trump. We need to debate the front runner. Chris Christie probably took the hardest hit at him, basically saying to Donald Trump, "Look, I know you're watching." He actually probably wasn't watching. He was probably giving a speech in Michigan, which he was trying to counter program at the time. But I'm sure he was watching the highlights an hour later. He said essentially, you're basically afraid of coming. You're basically afraid of coming here. You're afraid of what's going to happen. You're afraid of being against your opponents. Nikki Haley excoriated him a little bit. But most candidates were willing to take the gloves off to a certain degree.
But they really didn't take the gloves off. All they did was say you should be here. They didn't actually make criticisms.
There were a little bit of criticism. The main criticism against Donald Trump was the national debt. People would talk about the increasing national debt under Donald Trump. That was one thing that candidates would go after. Nikki Haley tried to go after Donald Trump's increase of the national debt while he was president. So that is one thing they went after. It was a policy difference more than anything else. You always have Mike Pence in kind of the unenviable position of having to defend being a part of the Trump administration, defend the Trump administration, even though he's very much an adversary now of Donald Trump, at least politically. So you do have that scenario, and candidates did bring it up a little bit. But you're right, it wasn't anything. It certainly was not a knockout blow against Donald Trump. Chris Christie's the only one that seems to really be taking on Donald Trump that made this debate.
On Fox News recently, there was a Fox News host who illuminated and listed Donald Trump's mental failings. Did you see that?
No.
Well, people talk about Joe Biden being less than compos mentis. But if you take a look at what Donald Trump says, there's a list of things like, I ran against President Obama in 2016, and you need an ID to buy bread, etc. And the Fox host listed these. How much does mental competence figure in here? And does it really favor Trump? Does he seem mentally competent?
I think it's going to be a non-issue.
For both or for him?
For both, generally.
Okay.
In the general election, no matter who the candidate is, the statistic I often repeat is not last election, 94% of Democrats voted for Joe Biden, 94% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump, and that includes and obviously you have Democrats, the independents that lean Democrat or lean Republican, vote for Biden or Trump. They're voting based on policy. They're voting based on what they think of one candidate versus the other. Not even necessarily that. Those are kind of secondary and tertiary issues as well. But they're really voting on the policies of the person.
You think it's about, when it comes to Donald Trump, it's about policy? Because he didn't really govern. He didn't have the ability to govern or even the desire to govern. It seems more personal and based on charisma and strength rather than issues.
There's the affinity group mentality. No question about that. With Donald Trump, a lot of it is being about being in an affinity group. As soon as Donald Trump is criticized, you go to social media, you go on Facebook and talk about how he's a lord and talk about what a great guy he is. There is that, and there also is that on the Democratic side, not so much with Joe Biden, but with Democratic ideals, more so with Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. There are people that want to be part of the affinity group, not necessarily even about Donald Trump or about Bernie Sanders, it's just wanting to be part of that group, that us versus them, that Manichaean view.
Right.
But
that tribe.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. It's just like, being a Padres fan or an Oakland Athletics fan. But that being said, when you talk about policies, conservatives, anyone who's who's conservative generally will like Donald Trump, will like Donald Trump's policies, whether they understand them, whether they know what they are or not. The same thing on the left wing, people that generally are liberal, even if they don't like Joe Biden because he wasn't their first choice in 2020 and he wasn't the first choice of the majority of Democratic voters. He came in 4th place in Iowa, 5th place in New Hampshire. Then he ends up winning South Carolina and wins the nomination. But generally speaking, there are people that are going to vote for their tribe, their Democrat versus their Republican, no matter who that person is. And I think potentially what you're talking about with Donald Trump, that could be almost be neutralized because you're essentially talking about candidates who both, no matter who gets elected, whoever gets elected will be in their 80s, if it's one of those two, that is, during their administration. And obviously you can point to examples, whether it's physical health or mental dexterity with both candidates, and you can certainly show this person said this person said that. So perhaps it would be best for both candidates just to kind of neutralize this issue and not make it not make it an issue. But you're certainly going to see that with both sides. But I don't think Joe Biden is going to go after the mental acuity of Donald Trump. But Donald Trump obviously is going to do that with Joe Biden.
Interesting. What would another Trump term look like? Would it be about governing or would it be about revenge?
Probably both, basically. And it depends in terms of.
Would he spend any time governing or spend the whole time vengefully?
Rhetorically, he's going to spend a lot of time revenge. Certainly, when he goes on Truth Social, there's going to be a lot of criticism, lambastation of the Democratic Party, of those he doesn't like. Maybe he'll still go after kind of the familiar topics. He can go after Mark Milley, everybody else.
Right.
In terms of actual legislation, first of all, the Republicans would need to maintain their majority, which is so thin right now that Kevin McCarthy will not even ask George Santos to resign because he's afraid he'll lose that seat. They have a 9-seat majority, so he has to continue to have the House of Representatives in his corner. And if they do have the House of Representatives in his corner, he has to have almost a monolithic Republican caucus to vote his way. If you have folks like Dan Bacon, who represents a moderate district in Nebraska, voting with the Democrats, you're going to have a lot of problems. And there's so few conservative Democrats, really just like Jared Golden in Maine's the only one now, maybe Henry Cuellar in Texas, that it's very hard to see a scenario where he gets bipartisan support, where Democrats come over and vote with Republicans to get something actually passed in the House of Representatives. You need 218 votes. So you go to the United States Senate to get something passed, and right now the Democrats have a 1-vote majority. If they continue to have a majority in the United States Senate, then you're going to have that gridlock. Donald Trump's going to try to use the bully pulpit, try to shame Democrats into voting his way. But the fact of the matter is, right now, there's really only 3 Democrats who represent states that Donald Trump lost last time around: Sherrod Brown in Ohio, John Chester in Montana, Joe Manchin in West Virginia. And there's a strong possibility that all 3 of them will no longer be in the United States Senate. Accordingly, it would be in every Democrat's best interest to vote against Donald Trump. So you're going to see this gridlock, and a lot of it. And when you get to this gridlock and you get very little legislation passed, presidents tend to turn to foreign policy to try to make their achievements, to try to make their legacy. So you might see a lot of that. Potentially, maybe he'll go to North Korea again a couple times, try to make some sort of an agreement with Kim Jong-un. Maybe what will his relationship be with Russia? Will he go and meet with? Will he meet with Vladimir Putin? I know. Well, Biden will not, but
we know that he will do all he can to cease funding the war there. He's pals with Putin. He will throw Ukraine under the bus. 100%.
Essentially, that Donald Trump has said that he's going to get an agreement basically between Ukraine and Russia, and
he said that all the time. He has this hyper belief in his negotiative powers, which do not seem to bear fruit in North Korea with Putin.
That's what
lunacy. He said, remember, I'm going to go to North Korea and fix it like this. Kim's going to love me, and I'm going to make a deal in a day. Right. Fail. Epic fail there. I side with Ukraine in this, and foreign policy-wise, I like foreign policy better than domestic policy, actually. And
I call it intermestic because it all amalgamates.
Okay, intermestic. I'm one of the persons that sees Putin as a threat to Eastern Europe and Lithuania. Lithuania, they've always been afraid. And Latvia, those Baltic countries, afraid of being part of Russia again. And this does seem to me like the world is watching. Is the West weak or is the West not weak? This is a huge deal. China will be emboldened if we packed it in, I think. It's a big deal, but he's going to just throw Ukraine under the bus. That's sad to me. One other thing that's sad to me is the notion that Donald Trump, the fact that he says he will release the January 11 perpetrators, the ones that clearly did bad things. Like he has distanced himself from them and said, "Oh, they acted on his own." That's okay, fine. But to say, "Yeah, I'm going to let you out for these crimes that you did, which if I committed, down the street, I'd be locked up. They throw away the key. He's going to let them go. I'm a law and order person. I kind of obey the law, and it irritates me when people that wantonly break big laws like that get away with it and get actually endorsed. That's upsetting to me. Of course, it doesn't seem to affect a lot of people because Trump's numbers are still strong. But the Ukraine thing, or the Ukraine thing, however you pronounce that, wherever you put the emphasis, and the amnesty thing, the pardon thing, those really, 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 really grate on me. Why would you have to do that?
Well, Ukraine, first of all, I think generally speaking, the American people, even if reluctantly, would support continuing to support Ukraine financially and with arms as long as there are not, and this is where the line is drawn, as long as there are not ground troops, as long as we do not send troops,
Right.
as long as it does not land up, as long as it does not land up a war, certainly between Russia and NATO. That's the biggest fear, that somehow, I think the biggest fear is that Russia goes into a NATO country, and then on Article 5 of the Charter says that essentially all NATO countries have to come to the aid of that country, and then you have a world war. But I think from a United States perspective, with that secondary, most Americans will say, well, we reluctantly support, but obviously there has to be some sort of accountability. But if you send ground troops, then it becomes extremely unpopular. You saw that with Vietnam.
But then they're not. There's no hint of that.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. I mean, that would be. We have sent ground troops in before. We sent in Vietnam. If you go back to the polls showing right around 64, 65, Vietnam was Americans were very much supportive of the United States aiding Vietnam. But once we kept sending more and more ground troops, eventually it destroyed the administration of Lyndon Johnson in Iraq.
Right.
Actually, early on, because of September 11th, because there was kind of this mentality in the United States that the entire Muslim world was behind it. 60% of the country thought Saddam Hussein was somehow involved, that there was a nexus there with 9/11, even though he was an adversary because he was a secular despot. And Al-Qaeda certainly had an enmity toward him and would actually wanted 100,000 troops to repel him from going into Saudi Arabia.
Right. You really should have left him in power, right?
From a strategic standpoint, there is an argument that he was somebody who was kind of a bulwark against Islamism in his country, against the idea of Al-Qaeda, because he was a secular despot. For him, it was more about his own personal power, being a truculent dictator, everything else is about staying in power. He was a survivalist versus somebody whose role was essentially to effectuate a Wahhabi revolution and turn the country into what Afghanistan is right now under the Taliban. But essentially, in 2003, Americans just thought, because of the polls, because of 9/11, they thought that essentially the entire Muslim world was monolithic. They were all in this together. So the Iraq War was very popular. Now, gradually, it became less and less popular, to the point that by 2006, 2007, George W. Bush was registering some of the lowest job approval ratings since Harry Truman in 1952. So, generally speaking, though, if going into Ukraine, if you send ground troops in there, you're going to see a lot. It's going to be it's not going to be a proper decision. I don't see a scenario where ground troops actually.
No, it's not even on the table at all. Not even a little. One thing that's interesting is, I'm guessing that in some ways it's good that Putin remains in power, because Putin has not used nuclear weapons, even though various numbers of red lines have been crossed. He has not used tactical nuclear weapons. And so they kind of, I mean, that's a known factor, and a replacement you might have, Prigozhin is a guy who might have. Who knows about these loose cannons? At least they see Putin's mental system, one that doesn't want to use nuclear weapons. So there's that. And I think the United States views this as a chance to really grind down Russia and make them a non-player for decades. There was one other thing that I was going to say. I forget. Never mind. I guess I said enough on that. One thing that is remarkable is what Putin has done what he did for the country in about 30 years. What, say 19, what,
He came
90 to
oh,
to now? Because I was there in 1990, and it was, there was no food in the fridge. There was no food in the shelves. You could get cab rides for a pack of cigarettes. It was the beginning of the Wild West. And now when you see this Moscow, anyway, it's quite a metropolis with big shiny buildings and shopping centers, etc. So
well, he came in about 99, but so I guess you have to give some
yeah,
credit.
okay,
You get some
good
credit
point.
to Boris Yeltsin for that too, though.
Yep, I guess so. Unless nothing happened, maybe
Whether he
nothing
deserved
happened
it or not.
until 99. So he'd even get more credit for that. But I don't know. It's just god awful. Our allies attack a military target. He shoots at a hotel or a school or something. That's a bummer. Anyway, enough of that. What else? What have I not covered?
Well, I would just say, in terms of generally the debate right now, you have this scenario right now where Donald Trump is so far ahead that he's actually willing to take the criticism that people are going to say he's a coward, he's pusillanimous, and everything else. Chris Christie can go after him, but he figures, I'm so far ahead right now, I can take any potential criticism. This is really a general election campaign between Joe Biden and me. And essentially, these are just they used to call back in 1988. They called the Democrats the Seven Dwarfs. These are all the dwarfs. I don't actually have to be there. Never really seen a scenario like this, but then again, very rarely do you see a scenario where a former president is actually running for his party's nomination.
Right.
You have seen scenarios, and the one you keep hearing, Grover Cleveland, because Grover Cleveland actually did come back and did get reelected. He did have some opposition. You had Horace Boyce from Indiana, and you had David Hill. And this was fascinating because they were both New Yorkers. And when Grover Cleveland was governor, David Hill was his lieutenant governor. When Grover Cleveland became president, David Hill ran and won to succeed him as governor. They had a falling out, and they ran against each other for the nomination. Much of the New York delegation was divided. Grover Cleveland landed up actually winning the presidency, winning the nomination and winning the presidency that year. But you only had two real opponents to him this time around. Depending on who you consider a major candidate, you have anywhere from 7 to 13 Republicans running. Not to mention the 700 that are running in the New Hampshire primary that are just on the ballot in one state. But Donald Trump is willing to take that risk.
When it comes to, I'm noticing sort of a change in that. In the first few years, first year, two after Donald Trump's previous term as president, people were afraid to do anything to a former president.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that fear is dissipated somewhat now, with a new high in that area being the summary judgment against him. And it seems to be a trend, and there'll be less hesitation to apply justice equally now. And what do you think on that?
Well, I mean, you think generally in terms of, I know amongst other presidents, there's always kind of this special bond that they have, that they tend not to criticize each other on policy. Now, you do have scenarios where a candidate will come out during the election time, and Herbert Hoover, for example, campaigned against Franklin Roosevelt vociferously in 1936, 1940, 1944. But that's generally the precedent is you try to be somewhat you try to be somewhat sympathetic, and you try to be a listening ear. So, for example, Kennedy would call up Eisenhower to get advice. Carter would certainly do the same thing with Gerald Ford. He actually had him over for lunch a few times. He had Henry Kissinger, as Secretary of State, over. Now, there have been other presidents. Jimmy Carter was more in the Hoover line. He basically criticized George W. Bush over the Iraq War. He actually wrote a book talking about our endangered values. But Donald Trump is certainly a former president, and I think that as a former president, since he kind of broke the rules himself, both other former presidents and even members of his own party do not see it as disadvantageous to criticize him.
You think Chris Christie would be a good president?
I don't know. I'll just say this about his governorship in New Jersey, and he probably missed his politics. Is all about timing. Bill Clinton, right time, 1992. Jimmy Carter, 1976. Ronald Reagan, 1980. Barack Obama, 2000, and Barack Obama, 2008. Benjamin Harrison, 1888. But if you look at it, when he was governor in 2011, Conservatives all wanted him to become a presidential candidate. There was a movement to draft him, and he said, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. He runs for re-election, wins 61% of the vote. And then his second term was in many respects a disaster as governor of New Jersey. You had the Bridgegate scandal, for example, and his job approval rating and it's kind of been thrown on the wayside. But his job approval rating, his second term as governor, got below 20%. He was one of the most unpopular governors in the history of America. He was very unpopular. His own lieutenant governor lost badly to Phil Murphy to succeed him. So he went from somebody who had 70% job approval rating, who won 61% of his reelection bid in, by the way, generally a blue state of New Jersey. So he has certainly a lot of reasons to criticize his role as governor. And if he ever becomes a candidate that is, for example, on the level of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump really has to go after him, he can certainly go after him for that. He has gone after him a little bit for that, but his role as second term of governor of New Jersey is certainly a reason to criticize him. And if he had run in 2012, I think he probably would have garnered the Republican nomination. He probably would have lost to Barack Obama, but I think he would have won that year. And then by 2016, he runs for president, even though he's extremely unpopular in his own state, which became a vulnerability for him. And now this time around, he does have a niche market in that, well, Asa Hutchinson could not get into the debate, Bill Hurd could not get into the debate, and they're the only two kind of anti-Trump Republicans. He has a niche market because he's kind of the only game in town in terms of candidates that actually got into the debate who was completely and totally, in the aggregate, anti-Donald Trump. So that's his niche market. If you're a Republican and you don't like Donald Trump and you want somebody that's actually has a potential to get more than 10% in New Hampshire, he's essentially your candidate.
How would you define a good president? What does a good president do?
That is a great question. And you always hear the term great president. Great president is always referred to in terms of president. You never hear this you don't hear this all the time for other fields. And people even that don't know about politics always say great president. You have different examples of this. One of them would be how much legislation you can get passed. Someone like Lyndon Johnson, for example, he was able, 64, 65, whether you agree with it or not, he got Medicare passed, he got education, Secretary of Education, he got the Civil Rights Act, he got the Voting Rights Act, the Rat Extermination Act. He got that through. From
ability to pass legislation is one. What's another one?
That being if you are a wartime president and you win a major war.
Okay.
If you now this would be why you would be then you go back to Lyndon Johnson. If you could make the other case, would he be a failed president because he was not able to win Vietnam? He kept proliferating it, but at the end of the day, he was not able to win that. So that would be something that would be potentially make a president a failure. So he could potentially be a great president and a failure. Another one, now you hear this all the time about did he speak to the American people? Did he prepare them for the next century? Something to that effect. Which is kind of such a generic term because you say, how do you prepare someone? How do you build the bridge to the next century?
Well, like it's sort of the John Kennedy kind of thing, right?
Well, Kennedy, I think a lot of Kennedy being seen as a great president was because of the way that he died. Actually, from a legislative standpoint, you compare him to Lyndon Johnson. He was one of the most, and this is with a overwhelming Democrat majority in the House and the Senate. He was one of the most unproductive presidents in American history.
But as far as future goes, he was seen to be a president of the future, a new, young, hopeful nation kind of thing.
He did give a speech when he talked about, he was a great orator and he talked about going to the moon. From a legislative standpoint, an actual tactician getting legislation passed. The Trade Act of 1962 was probably his greatest accomplishment. Okay. He didn't get much passed. Now, you could argue if he'd been reelected in 64, maybe he would have gotten the Civil Rights Act. Maybe he would have his own great society, war and poverty. Maybe, I don't know. But simply from a legislative standpoint, from a foreign policy standpoint, he had a major failure in the Bay of Pigs. He came into power. There were 600 troops in Vietnam inherited from the Eisenhower administration. The day he died, there were 16,000.
Yeah.
The argument that if you can make the argument he was proliferating troops into Vietnam, and in essence, that could have been the precipitation for Johnson putting more troops in.
Good points. Is there a fourth thing?
A fourth thing in terms of, I would say, and this is something that the president doesn't necessarily have 100% responsible for, but I would say the general shape of the country and the economy when somebody is president.
Okay.
They begin to win the end.
So how does Donald Trump measure up on those four? Well, those four.
Uh, I think economically, that's something that Joe Biden would say that he's the only president with him and Herbert Hoover who have actually had job losses during his administration. Donald Trump would counter with that and say, well, African American, Hispanic employment, Asian employment were at record lows. So you can make a case for both sides of that. In terms of foreign policy, Donald Trump was the first president since Jimmy Carter that did not start a war. By what do I mean by that? Reagan, you had Grenada. George H.W. Bush, you had Panama with Gaddafi. I mean, Panama with Noriega. You had the Gulf War. Bill Clinton, you had sending troops. You had Kosovo. George W. Bush, you had Afghanistan and Iraq. Barack Obama, you had Libya. Donald Trump, sending a few cruise missiles in Syria, to Syria, there was not a major war. It's not a major or a minor war, rather. That is something that I think his supporters tend to point to. The first one since Jimmy Carter. From an ethical standpoint, I mean, certainly you had scandal after scandal. And from a standpoint in terms of foreign relations, that's something that certainly will be judged by history in terms of what our relationships were with other countries between,
like NATO countries, like Europe.
Yep. And now in terms of legislation, getting legislation passed, he did get his tax cut passed. Whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, he was able to maneuver. Now, was how much of that it was him versus how much of that was working with Mitch McConnell, who he limb based now, but Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, Paul Ryan helped him to get that legislation passed, and he was successful in one of his kind of flagship issue running for president was, I'm going to get rid of NAFTA. He renegotiated NAFTA, a new NAFTA agreement with Mexico and Canada, which is something that I think is based, particularly folks like the auto workers he's trying to get the support of. Though that is something that is very populist, and I think from that respect, he was able to actually get legislation passed. Now, what the actual effects of this legislation are, or any other legislation, you have no ideation in terms of what it's going to be like 10, 15 years down the road. But this is another thing. It's interesting. If you're a Republican with a Republican Congress or a Democrat with a Democratic Congress, it's probably almost like grading on a curve because you're more likely to get that legislation passed. Now,
right.
Bill Clinton, in his second 2 years in office, though, with Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House, with Bob Dole as Senate Majority Leader, he was actually worked with them to get, first Bob Dole, then Trent Lott, he got welfare reform passed. For example, he worked in a bipartisan way. His first year in office, he got NAFTA passed by working with the Republicans and the moderate Democrats against the liberals of his own party. But he was able in his second term, and in 1997, he was able to get a balanced budget agreement passed with the opposition of folks like Dick Gephardt, the minority leader in his own party, but working with the Republicans and the moderate Democrats. But it is a matter of grading on a curve. If you have a 90%, here's a group example. If you're a governor, like for example, the governor of Kentucky right now, Andrew Beshear, he's a Democrat. The Republicans have overwhelming majorities in both houses of the legislature. So do you grade that on a curve, or because he's not going to necessarily be able to get a progressive agenda passed because it's all just going to be his vetoes first of all can be overridden, and any legislation he passes, he's going to have to work with the Republicans. So that's a lot different than, say, for example, Maura Healey in Massachusetts, who's governing with overwhelming majorities in both houses of the state legislature that are members of her own political party.
I would think that strengthening the country would be an attribute that one would assign a good president. And unifying the country, a unified country is a stronger country. Our enemies divide us, like Putin. One of his strategies is to divide us, to weaken us. And would it be fair to say that Trump weakened us by dividing us?
I don't know how you can. First of all, I don't know how you can unify how a president themselves can unify a country. I can't think of any president that unified a country.
Things like the trying to get to the moon. I don't know. It seems like it can be done, but if you don't think it can be done, okay. Common goals, focusing on unifying rather than focusing on dividing. Okay. Will Donald Trump need to turn his back on the Freedom Caucus when it comes to the general election? He's turned his back on he's changed his course when it comes to abortion Will he have to change course when it comes to those folks as well when it gets to the general election?
Yeah, the answer is he has to distance himself from them, yes. And he's done this before, by the way. There have been members in his first administration who have opposed him on different things, and even from the right. And when he does that, he excoriates them sometimes on Twitter when he was on Twitter. But he certainly does not want to be seen as the candidate of Matt Gaetz, of Marjorie Taylor Greene, and of Lori Boebert, respectively. And it's hard because people see him that way. They see him in that light. Now, Republican conservatives can potentially criticize him, and Freedom Caucus members, Republican Assembly members, that's the other conservative group in the House of Representatives, can criticize him specifically for his support for the fact that the national debt increased, threefold while he was president. They can say, you kept spending, you worked with the Democrats, you made all these compromises, or potentially you can say you didn't stick to your guns during the government shutdown in 2019. You never got the border wall. This is something some Republicans are criticizing him for on the debate stage right now, like Nikki Haley. But he does have the short answer to your question is yes, he does. And members of the Freedom Caucus, if they actually come after him and say he's not really a conservative, he's a charlatan, that's how he actually probably helps them with the 7 persuadable voters there are, because they say, well, he's not one of them. He's more of a mainstream Republican. So he can distance. He has the liberty, if you will. He has the latitude. He has the autonomy to distance himself just a bit.
I guess finally, I think Chris Christie said that these elections are all about momentum. Meaning, if you go to New Hampshire, you don't have to win. You just have to do significantly better than folks expected. Oh, yeah. And any chance that might happen as the primaries get underway.
Well, first of all, that's completely true. Lyndon Johnson was speaking to the Veterans of Foreign Wars the day before the New Hampshire primary in 1968. He was talking about Eugene McCarthy and the fact that there were expectations that McCarthy would do well, even though he wouldn't beat him. He actually did come within 8 points of him, but he said that New Hampshire is the only state where winning 20% is a victory, 40% is a mandate, and 60% unanimous. And that's true. If you look at it, whoever comes in second place sometimes is more the story than whoever comes in first. Bill Clinton came in with 26% of the vote, lost to Paul Tsongas by 9 points. The next day, Bill Clinton declares himself he says New Hampshire has made Bill Clinton the comeback kid. And the story is not that Tsongas wins. He's from the neighboring state of Massachusetts. It's that Bill Clinton, as governor of Arkansas, comes in second place, and he's the head of Bob Kerrey and Tom Harkin and Jerry Brown and Larry Reagan and the rest. So there is a lot of validity to that. In terms of Chris Christie, he's essentially skipping Iowa. He knows that Iowa is not a state tailor-made for him. When he comes to New Hampshire, if he comes in second place in New Hampshire, he's been winnowed in the process. The next day, the story is not that Donald Trump likely won New Hampshire because he's supposed to win. The expectation is he's going to win. But if, say, Chris Christie comes within 10 to 15 points of him, he's going to get a lot of coverage next day. Money will flow in. Benefactors will look at him as the alternative. And it's not necessarily Chris Christie, whoever else. If it could be Nikki Haley, it could be Tim Scott, it could be anybody else. Yeah. And potentially, then you have the scenario where conservatives and donors are not going to give to another candidate they don't think can win and say, we need to unify with one person against Donald Trump from now on. If we have 7 people running against Donald Trump's going to coast to the nomination. So they may pressure other candidates to get out. And you saw this last time around with Joe Biden after Super Tuesday. You had Amy Klobuchar drop out and endorse Joe Biden. Pete Buttigieg drops out and endorses Joe Biden. Why did they do that? They wanted to stop Bernie Sanders, and it worked, and it became and Joe Biden eventually won the nomination.
So Trump lost last time. What makes folks think? I mean, what positive things have happened to make folks think that he would win this time? I see a lot of negative things, like right. Everything related to January 6th and the Georgia situation,
yep.
Election related stuff, New York fraud, and acting crazier. All that stuff has happened. Were there any positive things that happened to make folks think that there would be any different result this time?
You mean in terms of what happened during his presidency or what's happened since?
What's happened since?
That he's done?
Well, no, actually, including the presidency, but mostly what's happened since.
I think the general argument that Trump supporters would make is that they would say that the economy was better under Trump than under Biden, and that inflation was lower than under Trump than under Biden.
Yeah, but inflation takes a while to kick in.
But people
wouldn't you say that the the guy who was in charge 4 years before would be at the fault of the inflation, and then the guy now
Yeah, from a policy
who
standpoint,
who was the recipient of it dealt with it.
from
The
a
people don't
policy
see it that way.
from a policy perspective, yes, but in terms if you're a Trump partisan or if you're somebody that does, I mean, most Americans, first of all, they think that presidents almost have plenipotentiary power. They don't realize that there's a Congress. They don't realize that there is markets abroad that have nothing. That there are scenarios that have absolutely nothing to do with who the president is, and the president is not omnipotent in that respect. But people, so in the one respect, you have low information voters, and low information voters are going to say, well, when Donald Trump was president, I was better off, so I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. And then you have Trump partisans, on the other hand, contrary-wise, are going to say, Donald Trump did this. The economy was here. The economy was there. The economy was there. There was very low inflation. African-American unemployment was low. Essentially, we need to bring back Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as soon as he gets elected, the first day in office, inflation is going to be virtually non-existent. And they just think that the presidents can just kind of have their magic wand almost. And the reality is presidents actually have a lot less power. And generally speaking, the state of the economy under administration, there's a lot they can do about it, the way they spend money, the way that they can make trade agreements, and certainly they have an influence on it, but it's not the only influence. And sometimes presidents are dealt a positive hand, and sometimes they're dealt a negative hand, and it all depends lots of times on policy, sometimes on world events that they have absolutely nothing to do with. Bupkis.
One of the causes of the explosion in inflation was that they kept interest rates artificially low, and the president pressured the Fed to keep them artificially low during his administration. Admonishing them, saying, you remember, he's like, told them to keep them low. And then finally, you get to a breaking point where inflation is going to shoot up. I mean, isn't that what happened?
Yeah, but people aren't looking at, most people are not looking at the intricacy of policy. I guess this is why folks like Aristotle and Socrates were against the idea of a direct democracy. Because in a direct democracy, the American people or the people anywhere are actually going to a town hall and actually making the decisions themselves. Generally speaking, the American people are just looking and they're saying, well, the economy is this state or it's this state. And they're saying that must be because of this president. That must be because of this president. And that's why, for example, presidents generally, if the economy is doing well, the way, for example, Ronald Reagan at the end of his term left with a 65% job approval rating, Bill Clinton left with a 66% job approval rating. That was because people looked at the state of the economy and they said that was because of that president. When Bill Clinton was during the impeachment process over the Monica Lewinsky imbroglio, what happened? Who saved him? The American people saved him because they looked at the state of the economy and they said if Bill Clinton's no longer president, potentially the economy could tank with that. They were giving credit to Bill Clinton for the strong economy of the late 90s. How much does he actually deserve? I don't know. It's probably a mix between the tech boom, between his deficit reduction, between a bunch of other things. But the fact of the matter is most American people do not understand the intricacies of policy. For that matter, how many Americans know who, there are millions of Americans who vote that probably don't know who the vice president is, or who think that, or who, for example, think that Kevin McCarthy represents the entire state of California. You're dealing with people that have lives that they're somewhat depoliticized, but when they go to vote, they just say, well, the economy's in this state, the economy's in that state, or they say, are we at war? And if we're at war, is it a no-win situation? And then we're going to vote for one person, we're going to vote for the other person. That's generally, it's just the state of things, and how much power the president actually has to do with that is kind of debatable.
All right, one more question. Would Gavin Newsom be a contender?
Yes, I think if Biden were not running, he would be running. I think he's a surrogate and very effective surrogate for Joe Biden. I think he sees himself as the heir to Joe Biden, to whatever happens in 2024, Joe Biden will not be running in 2028. He sees himself potentially, he's probably in the best scenario because if he was running this year, he'd also have to be governor of California. It's kind of hard to be governor of the largest state in the country and be a presidential candidate. But if you did not run for re-election, and obviously in 2026, then you have 2 years, you have 2020, 27, and 28 to spend all your time running for president the same way Ronald Reagan in 1974. He didn't run for a third term, so he had all of his time to run for president in 76. In his case, he lost to Ford, then he came back in 1980 and won the nomination. But he's trying to get himself in a perfect scenario right now, and that's why he's being such a good soldier for Biden. people say, why don't you run against Joe Biden? Why don't you run against Joe Biden? He's saying, well, Joe Biden's doing a good job, and he's pointing to all this. He's effectuating a reservoir of goodwill amongst Democratic benefactors and Democratic voters, to the point that whatever happens this time around, by 2028, he potentially could even be the front runner by 2026, 2027, the way the last big state governor, George W. Bush, was in 1997, 98, 99.
I think I must have been confusing Gavin Newsom with Alfred E. Newman.
I always confuse him with Gray Davis, who used to be governor of California, and he kind of had that kind of tall, thin build. And every time I think of him, I think of Gray Davis for some reason.
Okay, well, it's been almost an hour. This has been wonderful. Thank you very much. And congratulations on your breaking into the national scene. You've been called upon by a couple of national news organizations to do, well, basically what you're doing here. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay, and we'll talk to you, in a while.
Yes,
ladies, Rich Rubino. By the way, Rich has books. You might as well, come on now. You got your book right there. I think it's a cool book. You don't have to show it. You can tell them what it is.
No.
The Great American Trivia Challenge,
Trivia on steroids.
The Great American. I can't read it. You have to say it again. There you go. The Great American Political Trivia Challenge. Political trivia on steroids. All right. Very good. I appreciate it. It's a cool book, and Christmas is coming up. And if you're a person who buys gifts for Christmas, there's something to get. Happily, I don't buy any gifts for Christmas.
Oh.
Weird, right? But a long time ago, like 20 years ago, I started trying to indoctrinate my family into not exchanging gifts, because it's such a pain in the butt.
Yes.
It's a terrible pain in the butt. You go out and you're going to go shopping, and it's crowded, and you go into these Macy's and these horrible stores. You buy stuff they don't want, that they have to return. You go out of your way to get something good, and people get you junk. Then you got to return it or throw it away. It's just a big sad mess.
It's a conspiracy as well.
It is.
The man's trying to put us down.
And what we do is a simple meal together. Either at somebody's house, or we go out to a restaurant and take all that money, or some of the money saved from buying stupid gifts that no one wants, into having a deluxe dinner. And it's a lot nicer. So that's a side thing, but just to let you know, I don't buy any gifts. Such a pleasure, and I see people shopping, and I feel bad for them. Do the work, people, and get away from the whole gift giving, because it sucks this Christmas spirit out of Christmas. That's what I say. Is there any Christmas spirit in dutifully going off to wherever? Anyway.
Probably not. A lot of it is just kind of standard operating procedure. This is milk. This is how we do things.
Plus, it's such a bad thing when you get, if you stay with somebody for a long time, over, like, say you've been with somebody for 40 years, you have 40 years you live in a small apartment, you have 40 items that they have to keep forever in some box or something somewhere. Just junk piling up. They get me 40 things. There's 80 things in the small apartment. Really? They're down in storage. And also, it's very tricky. You can make a bad gift choice. I'll finish up with a story of my bad gift choice. A long time ago, I was going out with someone, like way back in the 80s, and I thought, they're going to love this gift. This is for their safety. They have terrible tires. I got them some tires.
Tires?
I learned the hard way, don't get a girl tires. And, 4 tires is an expensive gift. And you think, they're going to love it. I love tires, So what I guess, I projected my love of tires onto somebody else. It was so sad. The girl's mother practically cried because it was such a stupid gift. It was, so that's another reason. Bleep the gift giving on Christmas, because it's just, potential disappointment. You get somebody the wrong thing, and they have to fake, oh yeah, thank you so much. And then, or even worse, you have to fake. Because let's face it, most of us in America, well, I shouldn't say that, many of us in America have most stuff we want. Have most stuff we need. So getting somebody something that's going to light up their world is a lot harder than it used to be. Back in the day, you get little Jimmy a new pair of socks, he's all happy. But now, the chances that you could actually thrill someone with a gift are pretty tiny, and and vice versa. And you have to, when you receive your gift, feign excitement. Oh, this is perfect. Oh yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
With one
And in your
exception,
mind, you're thinking, oh no, I gotta go to wherever
with one
to
exception,
return this. Oh God.
with one exception, and this
Money.
is almost foolproof. If you want to get a gift from somebody that all generations, everybody will absolutely love, get an autographed picture, put that standing together of Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer.
That's a sure winner.
All generations will love that.
Anything,
Generations.
anything political. Just get them some campaign buttons from the turn of the century. Okay. Thank you very much, Rich Rubino. Talk to you next time.
We'll do. Awesome.
Exactly 1 hour. Very good.
Oh, awesome.
Okay. And